It's an annual rite on the Russian calendar. Vladimir Putin taking calls from listeners, everything from what's it like to be president to complaints over rising petrol prices. Government ministers, regional governors stand at attention to field grievances. It's a format that projects all of Russia's strengths and perhaps weaknesses. After all, it's the only chance some citizens feel they have to get Moscow's attention. The same holds true for the man himself. At 65, Vladimir Putin's just been re-elected to what on paper is his final 6-year term. He's still under Western sanctions, but the populists he supports across the EU keep rising. Italy's new government calling this week for the normalization of ties with Moscow. And as the G7 nations convene in Canada, they seem as annoyed with Donald Trump as they do with Putin. Finally, there's what's billed as a legacy moment, the kickoff, 1 week from today, of the World Cup in Russia. Putin himself admits he's not expecting much on the pitch from the home side, but it's a chance to host the world. What will we learn about Russia during this tournament? Today in the France 24 debate, it's Moscow calling. With us to talk about it, Anton Kozlov, Associate Professor at the American Graduate School. How are you?
Thank you.
Well, welcome as well to Elliot Lievre, journalist at the news agency Sputnik France.
That's it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
From the Estonian capital, we are with Russia watcher and political consultant Molly McHugh. Welcome back to the show.
Having me.
And a pleasure as always to have with us in our midst France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The show is called Direct Line. 4.5 hours it was this year. Brian Quinn takes a look at the 2018 edition.
A leader in touch with the common people. That's the image Vladimir Putin looked to project once again Thursday on his annual nationwide call-in show. The Russian president, early on seeking to reassure his people on the state of the economy.
We have taken the trajectory of stable economic growth. Yes, so far it's modest growth, not rapid. I've already said that. But it's not a decline, it's an advance, 1.5% over the last year.
Putin was sworn in exactly 1 month ago following an election that saw his main rival, Alexei Navalny, barred from running. He begins a new 6-year term on a drive to boost living standards by increasing social and infrastructure spending. This year, Putin did away with the usual studio audience, instead showing direct video lines to regional governors, state ministers, and company heads standing by to take his orders. It's the 16th Q&A show since Putin started the tradition in 2001, using it to show himself as a concerned advocate for the average Russian and a defender of the country's interests on the world stage. It comes as Russia finds its international ties strained by its roles in ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Syria, along with the poisoning of a former double agent and his daughter in England, and investigations of interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Putin's critics say the event, held just days before Russia hosts the World Cup, is little more than theater designed to convince ordinary Russians that they have any say in a country where democracy has become essentially an illusion.
It's more than theater, though, Anton Kozlov, our Moscow correspondent, telling us how one man at one point during the show was asking about landfills, overflowing landfills, and saying, why is this the only way I can get the attention of authorities on the matter?
Well, this is true because, in fact, it is sort of a direct democracy spectacle. Because Putin, during this direct lines, he has to sort of micromanage issues in Russia that cannot be, for some reason, be resolved otherwise. And it clearly shows the weakness of political institutions in Russia and of state institutions. Because if you have to call on the president to fix your railroad station 3,000 miles from Moscow, clearly there is a problem. And we do have a lot of stories and a lot of issues like that, and it's Putin who would have to take charge of issues that should be resolved by local administration. And it's in many ways this shows clearly that Russia is a dysfunctional state. It is a weak state. When the president has to take care of issues like where to put the handword, how to open the new school, how to help the newlywed to buy an apartment, and so on and so forth.
The institutions might seem weak, but there's no doubt, and our correspondent said as much, that Putin himself seems strong in such an exercise, Robert Park.
Yeah, I think that's the point. It's absolutely the case that the institutions in Russia are very weak. Things don't get done. There is complete distrust at local and regional level between the population and the politicians that serve them, as well as the governors that serve them. But somehow or other, Putin manages to manipulate that weakness to his own advantage, as we're seeing here in this sort of phone. It rather reminds me of 19th century Russia with the benevolent Tsar and the petitioning peasants who would send their complaints into the Tsar and he would solve some of the problems for them. It's the same thing is happening in modern Russian today. The simple people are petitioning the benevolent Tsar in Moscow and he's sorting the problems for them. Oh, every now and then you do get a dissonant voice as well.
Every now and then you do get a dissonant voice. Molly McHugh, what struck you during those nearly 4.5 hours?
It was quite long, but not as long as some years. I think there really was this sense of the kabuki of Putin needs to look as if he doesn't know about these problems in Russia. There was a repeated return to the numbers. Things are getting better. His new tagline, Russia doesn't have time to spare, that we have to move forward quickly, and there's a plan to do this. But this aspect of there's all these bad things going on in the country, and if only Putin knew, then they would be solved, is complete political theater. And it was excellently staged this year with the dozens of officials standing by on Skype to be directly excoriated this time, as opposed to sort of delayed excoriation, which has happened in previous years, where the tough questions were passed directly back to local authorities. And this has always been the way that Putin has passed on concerns about corruption and failure and the inability of institutions to deliver. It is not the center. It is, in fact, the localities that are the problems. So I saw a of what we've seen the previous years.
Elliot Lelievre, your thoughts on the format and on the show?
Well, Miss McHugh call it political theater. I call it political communication, and it's pretty good. Yes, the system in Russia is sometimes weak. Some local authorities or administration are weak. That's true. There's a lot of bureaucracy. I can assure you that, but the person of Vladimir Putin shows strength, shows efficiency, even if the authorities on the local scale do not prove that efficiency. He shows it, and he shows it pretty well. The communication is it fulfills the goal, and it's not only. The target is not only the Russian people, but also the foreign people. It's not it's made on purpose that it's translated on RT live. It's to make the Russian communication available for the rest of the world. I think that's a good thing. The Western point of view is what it is. The Russian point of view is what it is. Both are different. One is not true and the other wrong. They're just different point of view, and both are acceptable. So I think it's just political communication. It is well done.
All right, so definitely the hardball questions came on domestic matters. What was striking, and you were pointing it out when we were discussing it earlier, Robert Parsons, is on international affairs, he got an easy ride. What with Russia, pretty much everybody at this point okay with them staying on in Syria. There's also a G7 getting underway in Quebec on the other side of the planet. And yes, Donald Trump's name invited itself into the conversation over in Moscow earlier.
Not so long ago, one of the famous and popular German media outlets wrote that President Trump is pushing Europe into Putin's arms. If we combine it with an earlier joke that Russia affected the US elections, then altogether it makes it quite funny. So, we allegedly affected the US elections, and for that, Trump gifted Europe to us. That is sheer nonsense. You can't call it anything but a joke.
Your reaction, Anton Kozlov?
Well, I think, Putin, he likes to, first of all, not to answer questions and to sort of, bring some kind of anecdotes, that kind of, in terms of communication, I think he's a very capable man because he knows how to deflect attention, how to tell stories that had nothing to do with the question. And I think that's why he is.
But what do you think of him taking a swipe there at Trump directly and pointing out, hey, look at all the effectively look at all the trouble he's going to have.
No, but I think what he says basically he gives Trump a sort of a credit that Trump doesn't push Europe to the hands of Russia. That it's a joke. That Trump is sovereign, sort of independent, whatever he may be. I think Putin, they're still waiting to see whether they can improve relations because Trump certainly is. Would like to improve bilateral relations with Russia. He cannot because, for obvious reasons, the Russian investigation, certain domestic political issues, and so on and so forth. So we should remember how everyone in Russia, well, political establishment, the parliament, the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, celebrated the election of Donald Trump, expecting that now, after Obama era, things will get better. They did not get better for whatever reason. But I think Putin's still waiting and sort of hoping.
But you got the sense he's taking a jibe there at Trump, that he's poking fun at him.
I think I wouldn't call it poking fun at Trump. I think it's the European media.
I agree with that. I don't think he's really poking fun at Trump. He's laughing. Almost sniggering, I would say, because things are falling into his lap very conveniently just at the moment. He's just come back from Austria, where there's a government which is in favor of ending sanctions against Russia. He sees the same thing happening in Italy, also in Hungary, also in Greece, also in Slovenia. He's feeling very confident. He sees the cracks that are beginning to emerge inside the European Union. And he understands that part of the reason for those cracks, not the sole one, but part of the reason is the fact that the European Union is searching around desperately in the wake of the differences between itself and Donald Trump's United States on Iran, on climate change, on tariffs on steel and aluminium and so on and so forth. We saw President Macron in Russia last week taking a much different approach to Russia than his predecessor or predecessors have done, looking at Russia, trying to pull it towards France, towards Europe, to see whether they can find common ground, and clearly concerned about the issues of Iran, sanctions, tariffs, and climate change.
Your thoughts on that, Molly McHugh, and also what was your impression listening to the way that Vladimir Putin talked about the relations with the United States?
There was from Putin this very dismissive, jokey aspect to what he was saying, which has been fairly standard in how he is discussing the United States in the past year or so. Because as the previous speaker said, everything is falling in line for Russia. I think the chessboard from the perspective of Russia, looking at Europe, looking at the transatlantic relationship, looks pretty darn good right now. And you can expand that one step further and look in the Arctic and in the Middle East. Russia's had a good couple of years. And I think the disappointing part is, yes, Trump is a very difficult personality toward our allies. No one has figured out how to diffuse his sense of attacking the allies as opposed to the enemies yet. But the way that we are all reacting to this is making Russia, or putting Russia in a more significant position to leverage these divides. And we are all sort of making it worse on both sides of the Atlantic, knowing that the benefactor of this is going to be the Kremlin.
Your thoughts on the Macron way of dealing with Vladimir Putin, the fact that he did make the trip to that big annual business conference in St. Petersburg?
I think in general, we keep trying this idea of a reset. Yes, there's many things we disagree with Russia on, but if only we can cooperate on certain things, for example, economic affairs, everything is going to be fine. And that never works because Russian money is corrupting our societies and buying us. And we need to stop taking this approach that it's fine to cooperate economically with Russia, and then we need to disagree on things where we disagree. We need a harder line about containing the influence that Russia is having on our societies, which is projecting this corrosive corruption these subversion campaigns against our democracies, and we need to call them what they are and stand more firmly against the way they're trying to influence us.
Elliot Duliev?
Well, about corrupting the economy, I completely disagree. I mean, is Monaco corrupting the French football? I don't think so. And the money comes from Russia. You can't say that money corrupts someone because of the origin of that money. It doesn't depend on the origin of the money, but on the people behind it. That's two different things. And private citizens, Russian private citizens, are sometimes known for mafia activities. That doesn't mean that everything is related to the Russian government. We should not make the confusion between citizens and governments. That's the first thing. And the second thing is you can't have a good relation with Russia if you always have a lack of confidence in the first place. I think the Macron way of dealing with Putin is better than most of the European leaders right now, because at least he uses diplomacy. What is diplomacy? Is maintaining dialogue, even though you disagree with the person in front of you. That's the most important thing with Russia. That is one of the main partners in the international community. And France cannot turn its back on Russia at the moment when the relation with the US are going down. That would be suicidal.
All right, we're gonna pick up on these points when we come back, and especially how they're affecting Europe. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, 1 week ahead of the World Cup in Russia. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, taking part in that annual exercise of taking phone calls from ordinary citizens. Direct Line, the name of the show. We're talking about it with Anton Kozlov, associate professor at the American Graduate School. Elliot Lelièvre, journalist at the news agency Sputnik France, from the Estonian capital, Tallinn. Political consultant Molly McHugh is with us, and France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. Robert, who was mentioning how earlier this week Vladimir Putin was welcomed with open arms in Vienna for a one-day state visit. Austria's conservative Chancellor Sebastian Kurz in a coalition with a far-right Freedom Party that's openly pro-Putin. This, as an unprecedented populist coalition, was being voted in the same day across the border in Italy.
We will support opening up to Russia, which has consolidated in these last years its international role in various geopolitical crises. We will push for a review of the sanctions system, starting with those that risk humiliating Russian civil society.
Anton Kozlov, is it a turning point? What's going on in Italy?
Well, maybe for Italy. I don't think it's a turning point for Russia. And I would like to come back to what had been said before the break regarding the mafia being some kind of, peripheral phenomena in Russia. I think Putin is the godfather of the system that is profoundly criminal, profoundly mafia-like. It's certainly not some sort of, a local gang in Moscow or local gang in St. Petersburg. We're talking about billions of dollars being stashed away and used to finance his staying in power. That's what the whole thing is about.
Right, but we don't have the kind of open crime we saw in the 1990s in Russia.
Well, we do not have maybe the same level, but we do have pretty high rate of murders. We do have pretty high rate of theft, embezzlement, and so on and so forth. We certainly have an imitation of a fight against corruption. Russia remains a profoundly criminal state.
Yeah, and that's the point, I think. It is a criminalized state, and the money that comes out of Russia serves the interests of the criminalized state. That is why it's dangerous in countries like France or the United Kingdom, wherever you find it. And that's why, at the moment, in the United Kingdom, they're introducing legislation to address
All right,
specifically that
so
problem.
which way, Robert, is it going? Because on the one hand, we saw this a couple of months ago, the news cycle was all about the Skripals and this international outrage that had been whipped up. Now today, we're seeing, again, we just saw that clip of the new Italian prime minister.
Absolutely. You know, the first thing that has to be said is that people aren't, the Western countries, the European Union, the United States, aren't imposing sanctions on Russia for the sake of it. You know, everybody would like a good trading relationship with Russia. It's a huge country, a very big economy, and it would be in everybody's interest if trade could be free and fair, no political problems associated with it. But the fact of the matter is that there are political problems associated with it. That is why the sanctions were introduced. Have those political problems gone away over the last couple of years? No, they have not. So why should we be talking now about lifting the sanctions? It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Why are the Italians talking about it then?
Well, they're talking about it because Italy could do with the trade with Russia. It's simply that. That's what they're interested in. There may be some ideological sympathy as well, but the main reason is because the Italian economy could do with the trade. All European countries could do with the trade. It's in everybody's interest for there to be a good trading relationship. But Russia has behaved, one could say, delinquently on many occasions. You know, it occupies part of Ukraine, Crimea. Its forces are known to be moving in and out of eastern Ukraine. It occupies 2 parts of Georgia. The list, I could go on and on with the list. Russia is not behaving in such a way as to merit the lifting of sanctions.
Italy, which, by the way, won't be making the trip to Moscow next week when the World Cup kicks off. The World Cup, a chance for sports reporters, well, to get out of Moscow. 13 cities in total, everywhere from the capital to the sleepy town of Saransk. During the press conference, Putin warning Ukraine not to try anything during the tournament. The closest venue, you can see it on that map, to where the fighting is going on in eastern Ukraine is Rostov-on-Don. Vladimir Putin also was asked what it would take to make the most of the infrastructure once the tournament is over and prevent those stadiums from becoming white elephants.
It is necessary that the entire infrastructure, I absolutely agree with you, it must work first and foremost on the development of sports, notably mass sports, children's sports. Children and youth teams and leagues must be created, competitions must be organized. We must redeem the value of these World Cup infrastructures, and they must work efficiently.
We hear Putin there talking about how children and youth teams must be created. Why haven't they been created before, though?
Well, it's a series of problems. In the 90s, Russia was pretty weak economically. They didn't have the money to finance the infrastructures and to compete with the West in football mainly. As you know, if you win a lot in football, you earn a lot of money. And then FIFA and UEFA use that money to build infrastructures, to promote activity in your country. That's what they do as well in the hosting country of the World Cup. But they didn't realize the importance of sports as a soft power tool. They did right after South Africa and...
Hang on, Russia didn't realize the importance of sports as a soft power tool?
I don't think they did until...
We're talking about the former
South
Soviet
Africa.
Union, where sports was a political design.
It was, but then there was the economic and political crack, and the money was very long to come back to sports because it wasn't seen as a priority by the government. The military, the energy, the infrastructures, and I'm talking about railways, airports, etc., had to be modernized before stadium, pitches, whatever that is. And even more in a country where 9 months a year you can't play football outside.
Anton Kozlov?
Well, I think sports and athletes did play a very important role. Even during the 1990s, I would say 90% of the gangsters were former athletes. There was a political party created in 1993. It was called the Party of the Athletes in Moscow. So in terms of their presence, I mean, if you look at the Russian parliament, the State Duma, there are I don't know how many boxers, jumpers, joggers. I mean, everybody is either a television producer or an athlete or a film director. I mean, there are no legal experts.
But to Elliot's point, is it just a question of, well, football, since the great heyday of the 1950s or even the great teams of the 1980s, it's just not as popular as, say, ice hockey.
I disagree. Russia was never very good at football. Russia is the country, the Soviet Union, that played very good in hockey and basketball. I mean, among other things. But football was not their strong point. Now they've been investing. They've been trying to raise good soccer players. So I would say that it's going up. It certainly, during the Soviet period, it was not something that important. There were other sports that were given priority to. But I think it's been developing, and they just built a new sport arena in St. Petersburg. They spent, I don't know, $2.5 billion, half of the money got embezzled. They still cannot open it. Nevertheless, they invested because it's the Zenit team and it's Putin's home city.
Molly McHugh, stories about white elephant stadiums. We're going to hear a lot of them over the coming week. And then we'll hear that first whistle from the first match, and all will be forgotten.
Look, this is the game Russia plays. In Sochi, the Olympics were a disaster. The snow was slush, But it doesn't matter. Every time Russia does these events, they do it because it helps launder their reputation. Nobody is talking about the 60 FSB agents that were responsible for a pee laundering operation to help their doping in the last Olympics. Nobody's talking about the fact that every official who has helped expose that doping scandal is either dead or in hiding in a foreign country. I mean, every time there's a story written from the stupid Russian World Cup that is going to be about a stadium somewhere in some tiny little podunk town that has nothing to do with the corruption it is built on, the kleptocracy that fuels, the way that money purchases influence in our society and in political parties that are not conducive to transatlantic relations. And that money is taken away from the Russian people who are suffering because of it. Every time that story doesn't say that, every time it's just about the silly stadium, it's a win for Putin and he knows it. And that's why they spend so much money on these events.
Robert Parsons?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just a couple of points. It's interesting what you're saying about football never being massively popular in the Soviet Union. I think that's by and large true. The two teams that were really successful in the Soviet Union, that's Dynamo Kiev and Dynamo Tbilisi, were not Russian. One was Ukrainian, the other one was Georgian. But yeah, on the wider issue of why we've had this problem with sport in general and stadiums and so on in Russia, it's all associated with corruption. The money disappears. You look at Sochi. The amount of money that was spent on Sochi was absolutely phenomenal. Way over anything that had even been spent on a Summer Olympics before that. And this remains the problem. And I think this is what President Putin was referring to today, is what happens afterwards, with these stadia and the infrastructure that's necessary to support them. If corruption remains the problem that it is at the moment in Russia, the infrastructure that is needed to make sure that those stadia that have been built don't just simply turn into white elephants will remain the problem. The white elephants will remain as that, just that white elephants.
You heard Molly McHugh there saying that every time there's a story that doesn't mention all these issues, it's going to be a win for Vladimir Putin. Well, let's face it, sports fans, they're going to want to hear about team tactics and results. They're not going to want to hear every single story have a long disclaimer about all the things that are wrong with the sporting system in Russia.
No, I think that's true. But what it does, people aren't stupid and they see these things going on. The people who live in Sochi know perfectly well where the money went. But what it does is it feeds drip by drip into the sense of disillusion amongst ordinary people with the state of which they are a part. It's not necessarily going to lead to the overthrow of the system or to the removal from power of Vladimir Putin. Almost certainly not. But what it does create is a complete break between the ruling elite and the rest of the country. We heard one woman today, it's interesting that they allowed the question to go ahead, speaks, I think, to a certain confidence on the part of Vladimir Putin. One woman called in today and said, life is terrible for us, and it's getting worse and worse. It's only good if you live in the Kremlin. You know, there is a real sense of delusion, I think, disillusion amongst ordinary Russians. If you don't live in Moscow, you don't live in St. Petersburg, or perhaps Yekaterinburg, then life for you has not got an awful lot better over the last 15 years or so.
If the national team, and we heard Vladimir Putin today managing expectations, saying he's not expecting much from the home team.
If it's right not to.
But if it fares poorly, does it have an adverse impact on him or on Russia?
I don't think winning or losing will have a strong impact. I think he already won by organizing the World Cup and by putting Russia on the front, on the headlines. But to go back to the white elephants, I just want to point out that few measures have already been taken to promote and reuse the infrastructures that were created in Sochi. The ski resort there is the first and only Western-like in all Russia, if I'm not wrong.
But look at the vast overspending that went into creating
all right, there was a vast overspending, but today it's the ski resort is reused, and we see that the Olympic Village they try to reuse it. They, with certain success, but they try. They try to turn it into a business tourism, to organize press events, conferences, congresses, exhibitions there. They try to use it for a lot of different activities. He mentioned the access to sport, but for instance, in Sochi, the stadium where the Olympic Games started, will be the home stadium of a current St. Petersburg team that is moving to Sochi in order not to waste the money and build another stadium in St. Petersburg. So, yeah, they spend a lot, and at the same time, they try to use it better than Brazil did in 4 years ago, for instance.
Yeah, but don't you think it's a weird thing to move the St. Petersburg team to Sochi, and it's not going to be
second division team?
Yeah, it's going.
Second division team, right? That's moving from.
Yeah, it's. I mean,
it's not Zenit. It's
no.
Whatever. It's going to be a Sochi team, and no longer is going to be St. Petersburg team. But the point, I think, is they do spend a lot of money on building all this stadiums and the infrastructure. But I would say that by far and large, it's a big Potemkin village. You know, because they build it, they use it, they have to show that they're doing well. Instead of investing this money in building the real infrastructure, roads, schools. I mean, the secondary education system in Russia, I mean, is in tatters, I would say.
What about transports?
Transport, everything.
It's been... have you been to Moscow? The MCAD is a brand new metro line that is...
Yeah, well, thank God they did build in Russian capital, but in 2016, 2017, they built a decent...
There are a lot of infrastructure that are made in this World Cup. I'm sorry, but if you go in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ryazan, Kazan, or Nizhny Novgorod, for cities that I know, you can see more and more signs in English showing the places of interest, showing the metro lines, showing... It's little by little that Russia is modernizing, opening to the Western world.
Yeah, but my point is Russia is a huge country. It needs a lot of investment in order to develop the country in different sectors of economy. Instead of building all this fairly useless, I would say, like the Sochi infrastructure, village and all these stadiums, I think they should invest into something a little bit more important, needier, something that the people would be able to use, the new hospitals, new schools. That's, I think, what it should be about. Instead of building this mega project that are going to be used for about 1 week, and then they're going to basically fall apart because the quality of the construction, I think, is such that they're going to fall apart.
Well, that's one point of view. I don't know if it will be the case. I think not. I trust Putin when he says that he will make it so that they reuse their facilities. It's in Russia's interest to reuse its facilities and not to have the scandals that happened in Brazil.
But it shouldn't be Putin who should be saying that. It should be, it should be basically on the level of local administration, local political institutions. That
the euro was in did the local administration was in charge of the Euro 2016 in France? No, it was the government. It's a government project, government-sized project, and it's the government that has to make it real.
Molly McHugh, a final question on all of this, which is Vladimir Putin entering at the age of 65, what is on paper his final 6-year term. When the France 24 debate went to Moscow in March, many were predicting that there would be a big shakeup in the government to help with these reforms and these big projects that we've been talking about. We haven't seen a big shakeup inside of the Kremlin. How do you see, beyond the World Cup, Putin's entourage in the coming months and years?
I think, there will be changes over time. There always are. But the expectation that there was going to be a new prime minister or a vastly new cabinet or lots of new faces, this is, again, part of the kabuki that Putin does a good job engaging everyone in, so that the journalists can spend months spinning on these questions when the answer is going to be nothing is going to change because we know who Vladimir Putin is, and it's this. And I think we see more of that. And I think the expectation that we'll see anything different in terms of external tactics, internal tactics, flexibility, the ability to adapt and present something new, it's this. It's going to keep being a version of this. And I don't think anybody should expect anything different.
He's the uncontested leader. Why not bring in younger blood?
Well, there's always questions about that. What does he view as a threat to his position? Who does he view as loyal? I do think there is a new generation of I wouldn't call them quite elite. That's not really the right word, but there's a new generation of the oligarchy being brought into the fold. People who do take the money, who want to be a part of the system, who understand what the rewards of the system are if they contribute and if they gain merit within that structure. Those are the people that he's going to promote, people who are fully entrenched in the system of kleptocracy, who he knows will be controllable because they understand what the benefits are. And that's what we'll see taking new places and advancing in the next 6 years, is whatever the next generation of the current system is will look very much the same, but probably a little bit younger and probably a little bit more seemingly Western-facing, because that makes it easier.
All right, and we'll be talking about Russia a lot over the next month with the kickoff of the World Cup next Thursday. Molly McHugh, many thanks for joining us from Tallinn. I want to thank our panelists here, Anton Kozlov, Elliot Lelievre, Robert Parsons. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Yeah, we're talking about Direct Line. Hello, Charlie James.
Hello.
How are you? So what struck you, or what struck rather the people on social media and on traditional media about the call-in show?
Yes, I wanted to bring you some of the most talked about parts of the call-in show. The picture that was most shared would definitely be this grid of all of these ministers and governors looking not exactly thrilled to be there right then, and having some, people are having some fun with comparisons of this. Our own panelist, Molly McHugh, saying that this was the worst version of Hollywood Squares ever, referring to, of course, that classic game show where celebrities are put in the boxes and you play tic-tac-toe with them. So that's a funny one there. And Washington Post bureau chief in Moscow saying that it looked like a giant Google Hangout altogether. And finally, one more common, Oliver Carroll, the Moscow correspondent for The Independent, saying it looked like one of those photo editing apps that you use before you post your picture to Instagram. So people having a lot of fun with that grid there. Another thing that people were talking about was just how uncomfortable they looked. One one journalist saying, the Russia correspondent for The Telegraph, saying that we should spare a thought for Russia's governors and ministers who have been sitting at their desks on camera in constant fear. They each will be the next to be thrown under the bus by Putin for 4.5 hours there. And people sharing pictures of these ministers and governors looking, you know, not exactly thrilled to be taking these questions from people either. So having some fun there with the guests of Putin's show. Another thing that people were pointing out was that it seemed like, you know, as controlled as this event can be, it seemed like the text messages that were being projected behind Putin weren't as carefully constructed. There were some interesting ones. This one here that you're looking at says, why is there money for tanks, bombs, planes, machine guns, and no money for people? That
surprised you as well, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows that Putin is very supremely confident now. He can deal with that very easily. And it's, you know, it creates the impression that Russia is an open country. You can say what you like.
And here's another one that people were sharing that says, asking why the Moscow metro only has one public toilet. That was projected big and large behind Putin while he was doing this. So finally, the thing that people were very impressed about was just how long this event was. So clocking in
and it
4
wasn't
hours,
the longest.
4 hours, 26 minutes, and finally the LA Times Moscow correspondent saying that let's give credit where credit is due. Putin is 65 years old. He's been sitting there for 4 hours without a bathroom break. That's notable.
Fidel Castro used to do that. He used to speak for hours and hours without any break, you know, so there is a precedent.
Was he 65, though, when he made those 6 hours?
Probably, yes. He was.
He was.
Yeah.
So if nothing else, people impressed by his stamina.
Okay, many thanks for that, Charlie James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.